Welcome to Kaleidoscope. Let's talk.
Sri Lanka's prisons is a topic often ignored in favour of discussions about what kind of people are actually put in prison. The Human Rights Commission paints a grim picture, revealing that the treatment and detention of condemned prisoners fall far below the threshold of basic living standards. As of November 2023, the official capacity of the country's prison system is 11,768 inmates, but the occupancy level is at a whopping 220.7%. The prison population has been increasing from 16,000 odd in 2000 to almost 26,000 inmates in 2020. And it seems that there are more people behind bars than ever. But is every conviction deserved, or are there flaws in our system? Discussing the gritty truth is scientist, conservationist and public policy advocate Rohan Pethiyagoda on today's Let's Talk. Rohan, welcome to Kaleidoscope, and this is a subject that, hardly discussed really. But what are the most common reasons for imprisonment in Sri Lanka?
The most frequent cause of conviction to prison in Sri Lanka is relating to drugs. About half the 30,000 people who go to prison every year go there because they've been trafficking in drugs. So this shows how serious the drug conviction problem is. But also it highlights other things in society. For example, while Muslim people account for about 10% of the population, 15% of drug convictions are attributable to Muslim men. And drugs are strictly prohibited by Islam. And so I think there are indicators here for community leaders and religious leaders in that community to wake up and say there's something happening to our young men.
How would you describe Sri Lanka's prison population?
Primarily, prison is for poor people. It's very rarely that anyone from a middle or upper class background goes to prison. The other thing is people like you, women, don't get to prison. Only 5% of prisoners are women. 95% are men.
Maybe we are just good.
Yes, actually that is true, except when it comes, for example, to bribery. So very few people go to prison in Sri Lanka for bribery. Just about 100 every year. And of that, 20% are women, compared with 5% of women in the general prison population. And then you have the problem that 95% of the people in prison did not get educated beyond O levels. So that is a telling indictment. So the best predictors for getting yourself into prison in Sri Lanka are being poorly educated, being poor, and being a man. And that's not a good thing.
How many people remain in prison awaiting trial? Those who can't pay the bail, for instance. But in overall, what's it like?
That is the worst. About 2 or 3 times as many people are on remand as are in fact convicted. So about 60 to 90,000 people are on remand in any year. And about 30% of them are on remand for more than 6 months. So remand has become a method of extrajudicial punishment because the judiciary has very little control over remand. The police ask for it or the Attorney General asks for it, they get it. And we've seen egregious miscarriages of justice just in the last year in the case of Shani Abesekara, for example. Here's a senior police officer being put in remand for more than a year at the height of the COVID pandemic, at a time when prisoners were dying at twice the rate as the rest of the population.
So what is the social impact of imprisonment?
But the social impact, I think, is terrible because here on the one hand you have men. The densest demographic for imprisonment is men in their 30s, and most poorly educated men who are unemployed and in their 30s tend to be married and having children. So you're disrupting the families.
Are these mainly bailable offences?
The definition of a bailable offence is very moot now because more and more people are being incarcerated on the grounds, for example, that an investigation is underway or investigations are not yet complete or there's a danger of flight. When actually I think those risks are minimal. And so I think there is a huge amount of unnecessary incarceration in Sri Lanka. This is a really dangerous thing. The presumption of innocence is not there if you can just be thrown in prison for 6 months on the say-so of a policeman.
We have to look after prisoners with Sri Lanka's money, and that's the taxpayers' money. How does this impact the equation?
Cost is trivially small. It's very small. The cost of running the prisons establishment is less than the cost of running the wildlife department or forest department. Something. This is not a big deal in terms of the fiscal impact is not big. But what really does, I guess I shouldn't say amuse, is that people seem to go to prison on the most frivolous of contexts. There were 4 men in prison, in the statistics anyway, who were there for watching blue film. There's more than 100 women in prison for the offence, which I don't understand, lodging in the veranda, whatever that means. It's an euphemism for something, but I have no idea what it is. But more than 100 women are in prison for that offence. There's about a dozen women in prison for unnatural sexual offences, which I presume means lesbianism. But come on, this is not an age in which we should even hear such things. So on the one hand, there is frivolous imprisonment. On the other hand, there's malicious imprisonment, as we saw in the case of Shania Besekar. And then there's the judiciary trying to plod through the regular course of criminals and control really serious things like drugs and offences against people. So I think, by and large, the judiciary does a fair job. But I think they can only work within the framework of their rules and regulations. And that's the problem. The framework is weak. Or we shouldn't see frivolous cases like this going before the judiciary in the first place.
There's been some rhetoric about reform in prison law. How much of that has happened or how much has not, and what needs to be prioritized?
I don't think it's prison law so much. I think it's a question of reforming the police and having more oversight on the police. There's virtually no civilian oversight on the police, which I think is a problem. Just like we have for the insurance industry, I think it would be good to have a panel of ombudsmen overlooking the police, so that if there is a miscarriage of justice, it gets nipped in the bud at that point. And to have a panel of retired judicial officers, for example, sitting there who can serve as a kind of informal court of appeal long before cases get to that stage of prosecution. If the police do something wrong or the Attorney General's department does something wrong, and it's very clear from the Abesekara case that both those did something terribly wrong, then it gets nipped in the bud and somebody doesn't end up going into prison for more than a year.
So just going back to social impact, do we have a system that actually rehabilitates prisoners so that they can be put out into society?
Yes, we do. I mean, the prisons department, I think, is very sincere, and it seems to take an interest in doing its job well. The problem is the stigma. Once your husband or your father has been to prison, and it's almost all men, then there is a stigma for life. The children in school are not going to get a fair shake, for example, because the teachers have this thing that your father's a criminal or a convict or something horrible. The woman of the house has her own guilt to bear because of the way she gets treated in society after that. And those are things that rehabilitation isn't going to fix, because the vast majority of prisoners are married family people. And so rehabilitating that individual isn't enough. There has to be care also for the families. But there are many NGOs who go into the prisons and try to work with the prisoners as well. And the prisons department, I think, is pretty sincere in its job. These aren't evil people. They're trying to do a good job. But they're creatures of a system that they can't control, because if the system sends a prisoner into remand prison, for example, they have to take him. They can't say, no, we don't think this is a just full arrest.
So as a community, we're very insensitive when it comes to not just the prisoner, but also their families and the impact being in prison has on the extended family. As a message to the community, what would you like to say about prisoners and the way we actually treat them?
I think from time immemorial, we have looked at punishment as a means of revenge, as a means of getting even. This is a very primal kind of instinct in humans, just as it is in monkeys and chimpanzees and gorillas. We've all got it. But I think enlightened justice has to be about restoration. Restorative justice, I think, can mean hugely more for the community, because it tries to right the wrong rather than just punish the wrongdoer. And this is something we haven't approached yet. If we think about it just as much as today we look back at the era of capital punishment when children at the age of 12 were hanged for trivial offences, and we think how horrible that was, I think future generations will look back at us and say, oh, they imprison people for crime, how strange. Because we know that crime is largely driven, as I was saying, by other factors like poverty, being male. I mean, whose fault is that? And we have to fix those problems. This is largely a phenomenon that emerges from the properties of our brains. It's not the individual who's the criminal.
You brought up capital punishment. To do or not to do?
Oh, I'm completely against it. I think it's a barbaric system of justice. I think there are no circumstances under which the state can kill. Where is the legitimacy of a state? Where is the example you set to a people about the idea of vengeance if you insist on killing people because they have harmed? And we know, for example, in the United States, which has a very advanced judicial system, about a third of people on death row are actually innocent. Now DNA evidence is proving that they're innocent. I can't imagine that the statistics are any more different in Sri Lanka, especially when you consider that people who go to prison in the first place, who get convicted, are poor people. They can't afford the posh lawyers that are going to get them out of whatever scrape it is that they're in. So the miscarriage of justice is so high that it is never justified to kill somebody. It's one of the most inhuman and barbaric things that people can do.
Like what you see, don't forget to subscribe, follow and like us. Kaleidoscope is on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn.